I'm gonna walk us through the history of air quality in Utah. And for those of you who don't know me, I have a background studying climate science and air quality. I did a PhD in Oregon State studying greenhouse gases and ice cores, and moved to Utah about a decade ago to study air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. You can see some of the projects I've been involved with, putting instruments on top of tracks trains and Google Street View cars. And then about a year ago, a little over a year ago, I joined Utah Clean Energy to really help accelerate the deployment of solutions in our community and across the country. Briefly, just to kind of set the stage, we all live in Utah. We all know why it's important. We all know why air quality is really important. Of course, we exceed federal air quality standards now. It's roundabouts half of the exceedances are in the winter and half are in the summer, and it's caused by our emissions in our topography and our meteorology, especially the inversions we have and the chemistry we have. But really the reason why we really care is because it impacts our health. And so this was a study that I was a part of that came out a couple of years ago that looked at all of the different impacts from air quality on different aspects of our bodies. And here you can't, it's probably hard to read the text of each one of these, but the point of this figure is to show that each one of the systems in our body that are highlighted in red are from studies that have been done in Utah, and really just to illustrate all of the research that's been done in Utah studying the health impacts of air quality. And of course, it's not just the health impacts. Those, any health impacts propagate out into the economy and our quality of life, and et cetera. And this is why for quite a while now, when there are surveys about the things that affect Utahns, air quality consistently ranks pretty high. So this is a 2014 survey. Air quality is number 3. This one was really interesting because they actually asked about performance on priorities, and air quality ended up being dead last. And so it really illustrates that it's a major issue and we can be doing a lot more. Here are a couple of other surveys that are more recent, but air quality consistently ranks in the top 3 issues in the state. But really, air quality is a function of our energy choices. And so to really understand the history of air quality, we have to really look at how our energy systems have changed over time. So this is a plot for energy systems, energy consumption in the whole US. And the reason why I look at the whole US is because we don't have great data in the state of Utah prior to 1960. And so, but the whole US is a good proxy for what was going on in Utah. And so a lot of this narrative starts when we start having recorded records from the pioneers. I've looked around for records from Native peoples, and so far haven't been able to find great documented oral histories or literature on that, but that's still something that's kind of an open investigation, looking for some of those things. But when the pioneers arrived, they started printing newspapers, and those have been captured in the digital newspaper archive that's at the Marriott Library, and that really facilitated a lot of this research and looking into this story. One of the first references, or some of the first references to air pollution actually come from Brigham Young. So this is the front page of the Deseret News in 1860. This highlighted section here, and back then they just this whole front page of the paper is just remarks from Brigham Young from that day. So back then they just like, here are his remarks. It's the whole paper. But this section here, he says, what constitutes health, wealth, joy, and peace? In the first place, good, pure air is the greatest sustainer of life. And the context that he's talking about here is that we need to make sure that there are well-ventilated homes, especially, or good ventilation for homes, especially in rooms occupied for sleeping. So this is really practical advice for surviving as a pioneer. You know, if your chimney is blocked up and smoke builds up inside your house, you know, then that killed people back in the days. And so, but it's also really interesting that they're talking about the importance of indoor air quality. Of course, this has become an issue again as we're starting to understand the health impacts of using natural gas. Natural gas is mostly methane, but there is about 5% of your natural gas has a bunch of other stuff in it, like benzene and toluene and a bunch of other hazardous air pollutants. And you know, even though when your gas stove is off, it's leaking into your house, and you know, it's increasing rates of asthma and things like that. And then when the gas stove is on, it's releasing NOx into your home. And so the importance of indoor air quality is being revisited. And also, like, we're thinking about how wildfire smoke can percolate into your home, or our winter particulate pollution can percolate into your home. As Salt Lake continued to develop, and I guess one more thing I'll say about Brigham Young is that the early pioneers, they really saw air quality and having a pristine environment as being this moral good. And they would contrast the pristine environment in Utah with the really smoky and polluted cities on the East Coast that they had moved from. And they thought, you know, this is a sign that this place is, you know, a really special place, and you know, there's a moral imperative to be good stewards of the resources we have here. So nevertheless, Salt Lake continued to grow and industrialize, and things continued to get worse. And so when I started looking into this question of when did air quality become an issue in Utah, I thought it was, you know, maybe in the 1990s or maybe in the early 2000s. And boy, was I wrong. I was wrong by over a century. This is in the 1880s. This is when we really start seeing air quality regularly feature in the news in Utah. And so this is one of the editorials in the Deseret News, and they say Salt Lake's beginning to suffer from this smoke nuisance. A nuisance is just a public issue. And back then they didn't think about in terms of air pollution, they just called it smoke because you could see, you know, visible smoke coming out of whatever you were combusting. And they thought the time is coming when we might have to adopt some regulation, as other places have used to address this. But wouldn't it be just as well for the businesses that use coal in large quantities to look around and find some remedy for their excessive smoke of their own volition, and thus avoid the necessity of declaring their works a public nuisance? They're so kind back then, they said, we think so, and throw out the suggestion and kindness, which I think is an interesting phrasing. But really, what's most fascinating to me is the parallels with today. And there's a preference for, you know, private industry to find ways to reduce their own emissions without having to resort to regulations. And, you know, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But it's interesting to see the parallels with today. And again, things continued. They didn't really have clean energy technologies back then. And so things continued to get worse. And so the very first regulation that I've been able to find in Utah was passed in 1891. That's really interesting to me because that's 5 years before Utah became a state, which means that we've literally had air quality regulations on the books for the entire history of our state. And this is the actual text from the Salt Lake City Recorder's Office. They went back into the old books and found this for me. And it was a misdemeanor to emit dense smoke from chimneys. And you could get fined $5 to $50 per day, which in today's dollars are roundabouts $150 to $1,500 per day. And it was really targeted at large apartment buildings. If they're not operating their boiler efficiently, then they could get, you know, these fines applied to them. As a scientist, I was really interested to understand how the understanding of air pollution and meteorology changed over time. And so one of the very first references to meteorology that I could find is in 1893. And they were thinking about where to build factories. And the air pollution is an important thing to consider as we're developing the city and figuring out where to build factories. But there's some really interesting parts of this article. They didn't want to put the factories in front of the mouths of the canyons because they thought of those as the ventilators of the city. They knew that air flowed up and down the canyons. And it says those who are conversant with the air currents, that's what they called meteorologists back in the days. They understood that there are, air currents going in and out of the canyon. And if you put a factory in front of the canyons, it would blow smoke, air pollution over the entire city. They really had a limited understanding of meteorology though, because, one of the things that is here, it's smoke never crosses a river. And it is true that if you have a big enough river, or a big enough body of water, they can provide a thermal barrier to, some mixing. But of course, the Jordan River at the bottom of the Salt Lake Valley is not that big. And so that really wasn't very applicable to our situation, but that's what they thought. That's what they thought the best place to locate the factories is west of the Jordan River. This last piece here that I've highlighted, I think is really important insight though. It says factories that blacken the city with smoke can be as much of a detriment as they are an advantage, for Salt Lake has as much to expect from the increase she'll receive from persons who select it as their residence on account of its pure air and cleanliness as it has to gain from factories. So they're really trying to weigh the environmental stewardship as well as economic development, and recognizing that they wanted to have both of those things moving forward. And they're trying to figure out what tools do we have available? What can we do about how the city is developing such that we can both have be good environmental stewards of this resource, of this place we're living, as well as the city is growing economically. And so, these decisions that were made back in the 1890s and the conversations that were happening in the 1890s, they said, let's put the factories west of the Jordan River, which is kind of at the bottom of the Salt Lake Valley. That's, of course, where we have a lot of the refineries and the Gadsby power plant now. And it's become more of an industrial part of town. And, since that time, there's been a lot of infill as well. And that's where we have a lot of low income neighborhoods. And it's where we also have a lot of the environmental challenges that we see today and environmental justice concerns. Those decisions, those urban development decisions, likely also played a role in the practice of redlining that occurred in Salt Lake City and in cities across the country in the 30s and 40s. That was the practice of forcing minorities and low-income folks to live in certain parts of town that are less desirable. And you can see these red areas of town are listed as hazardous. And you can go and find these maps for a bunch of cities across the country, but this likely, and it's just interesting to see how air quality has been a really important factor in our history through time, and it's played a role in many different aspects of that. And of course, those decisions, the practice of redlining has reverberations to today. This is the map of demographic distribution in Salt Lake County, and so a lot of these areas are still where minorities continue to live. Going back to the history though, in the early 1900s, there was a really important era of conflict between smelters and farmers. Back then, smelting was really important industry as we're starting to do a lot of mining. And the emissions from the smelters there were no controls on the emissions. So they just emitted all kinds of crazy stuff into the air: lead, arsenic, sulfur dioxide, et cetera, et cetera. And what was happening is that the crops next to the smelters were just dying. And so, this was obviously not great for the farmers. And so they ended up banding together and sued the smelters. The smelting industry turned around and accused the farmers of being bad at farming. And this eventually led to a federal court decision in favor of the farmers. And many of the smelters ended up leaving the Salt Lake Valley. Some of them moved to Tooele or other surrounding communities. And basically wherever they moved, there were lawsuits that followed them. And, over time, they eventually would figure out how to install scrubbers on their stacks and things that could start to remove the pollutants. And so over time, the emissions improved. But this is, one of the early phases of that dynamic. This is a political cartoon from that era. Like I said, the smelting industry they were accusing the farmers of quote smoke farming, which is, rather than actually trying to farm a farm, you just buy a plot of land next to a smelter and then you just sue the smelter as a way to get your income instead of actually trying to be a good farmer. And so here in this political cartoon in the Salt Lake Tribune, you have the farmer here that's, complaining and say, Brother Joseph, do I have to farm my farm now? And here's the smelter that's about to move to another location. And since the Mormon farmer can no longer farm the smelters, he asks counsel from the authorities. So just giving a window into some of the dynamics and the conflicts that were happening 100 years ago as the city was starting to develop and struggling with these air pollution challenges. This is around the time that there were a lot of advances in farming science, and the smelters actually invested a lot of money into doing research. They were trying to prove that the farmers were bad at farming, but they did a lot of research into how to farm better, and that percolated out into society and could have played. This is also a time when there was a lot of innovation happening in farming practices, and so it's interesting to think about how, again, air quality in Utah might have had impacts in a lot of other aspects of our society. Moving forward, going back to our plot of energy, really this is the era when coal was our dominant form of energy within cities and for producing power, really for everything. And this obviously led to a lot of challenges. And so this was on the front page in the Salt Lake Telegram in 1912. They published a 6-part investigative series on air quality. This is the second one. This is the smoke nuisance. The part 2, the economic problem. And so, this headline just gets me every time. Millions of dollars go up in smoke. The annual waste of fuel in America would build battleships. That's a really bracing, comparison. And they understood that the influence on health is most detrimental. The health impacts of air quality, in 1912, they said they understood that this is a really important piece of the puzzle. And this last one, our whole system of power conversion ultimately may be changed. And so this is kind of crazy to me because we're often talking about we're in an energy transition right now and we're changing our power system. But really, we've been doing this for over 100 years. And when you think about that long-term context, you realize, we've been working on this energy transition since the Industrial Revolution. And initially we gained access to fossil fuels, and that's, they're really energy dense. But then there's all these negative externalities in the form of air pollution and now climate change. And so now, ever since then, we've been on this gradual process of cleaning up those emissions and figuring out better ways, more efficient ways to consume energy so that we can, get back to a better relationship and with environmental stewardship. But it's just surprising to me. They basically had all the information, all the pieces of the puzzle that they needed in 1912. What they didn't have access to were clean energy technologies. We often think about how air quality affects tourism, and that was one of the first slides that I showed from the New York Times. That was an issue back then in 1912 also. This is from, just a same general time period. Smoke clouds greet tourists in Salt Lake. The view of the city is impossible, says Ralph. He's one of the managers in the hotels. Visitors are unable to see the Walker Building from the top of Hotel Utah, according to the manager of the hotel. And those buildings were just a couple blocks away from each other. So you can imagine how dense the air pollution must have been, such that you couldn't even see across downtown. You couldn't even see the buildings from across downtown. This was also a really important era of environmental activism from women-led activist groups. And they did an amazing amount of work. They collected data on best practices. They made leaflets. They passed them out across the city. They attended a lot of public forums and passed ordinances. This is one headline of one of those events, and 50 prominent women representing the Ladies Literary Club and other clubs were present to urge passage of this air quality ordinance. At the conclusion of the meeting, which waxed exceedingly warm at times, the measure was referred back to committee. But they're working and passing ordinances, and they're passing ordinances across Utah. And it's just an amazing amount of work. It's really an impressive, unique role that happened, for women. That happened in Utah that didn't really occur anywhere else. And of course, there's, this is a really long legacy that continues today. Utah Clean Energy is led by Sarah Wright. And so it's really, and there's a lot of other groups that are led by women here in Utah, which is just really cool to see how this long legacy has played out in Utah. These are the couple of the women who were really leading out on that effort back then, Mrs. Lund and Alice Horn. And here are some of the pamphlets that they had. You can see these before and after images of the city, these like city beautification efforts. And really, it makes a lot of sense that they are really active on this, because they were really on the front lines of air pollution impacts. And they were often operating the stoves and the boilers that were creating air pollution, but they also had to clean the clothes and the drapes and take care of people when they got sick from air pollution. And so, they were really on the front lines of dealing with this. And so, and they were really active and using the tools that they had available to try to make the situation better. The legislature got involved in 1914. And this is really interesting to me, because when I was at the University of Utah, I was in the College of Mines and Neurosciences, but the Department of Atmospheric Sciences. And it was always weird to me that the Department of Atmospheric Sciences was in the College of Mines and Neurosciences, but it actually makes sense if you look at the history of it, because the legislature created the metallurgical department in 1914, and their first task was to figure out a way to process coal so that we could make a foolproof fuel that burned more efficiently and didn't create air pollution. So from the very beginning, our scientific endeavors to address this were really in partnership with the coal community and trying to figure out better ways of processing fuel to address air pollution. So I love these headlines, though. The metallurgist to attack Zion's smoke, and university takes up city smoke problem. And then that effort continued and ended up leading to one of the first major air pollution studies in the country. Occurred in the winter of 1919 to 1920. And Salt Lake City was chosen because it's a mid-sized city with this really persistent air quality problem. They thought that if we can figure it out in Salt Lake, then we can, apply it to New York and Pittsburgh and some of these other industrial cities. And they did a lot of stuff back then. It was really crazy. They did a fuel analysis. They created an emissions inventory. They looked at different sectors. They did a bunch of air quality monitoring. They looked at the meteorology, a really basic study of the meteorology. They looked at health impacts, and they recommended ordinances that were passed. And this is one of the reports, and one of these comments here I want to highlight is here in the middle. Continuous, never ceasing effort is required to clean up a smoky city. A few months of relaxation and some years of effort are canceled. And they were really talking about air quality ordinances and efforts to monitor air pollution. But I think that there are, again, some really important corollaries with where we are today. You know, if we think about the Great Salt Lake and in efforts to make sure that the Great Salt Lake doesn't dry up, you know, one good winter is not going to solve our problems. You know, we need to make some lasting improvements, and continuous, never ceasing effort is needed. And the same also goes for addressing climate change. You know, one winter or one year where we have mild temperatures doesn't mean that climate change is over and that we can, you know, stop investing in clean energy technologies. We need to have never ceasing effort, and we can't, you know, let months and months of relaxation go by. We need to really be after this and be looking for ways we can continue reducing emissions over time. One of the parts of this study that I think is really fascinating, you know, as a scientist is, you know, a lot of folks were complaining about the smelters and about the sulfur dioxide, and they thought that the sulfur dioxide was creating this heavy blanket. Of course, they didn't understand what an inversion was. They didn't understand there was a temperature component that was trapping pollution. They thought it was the sulfur dioxide from the smelters. And so the scientists in that era, he said, you know, that's not the case, but people kept asking him. And so finally he said, okay. So he got his flasks and he, you know, hooked them up to a vacuum pump and evacuated them. And then he got in a biplane and then flew up through the inversion layer and opened the flasks at different altitudes to collect samples, and showed that there wasn't a dense layer of sulfur dioxide trapping pollutants, but, you know, showing that it's really, you know, a lot of the air pollution was coming from, you know, homes and industries at that time. It wasn't just the smelters. But again, this is interesting to me because there's corollary today where most people blame our current air pollution on the refineries or the mine or something like that, when really the biggest contributors to our current air pollution are from our vehicles and our buildings, our built infrastructure. One of the tools they were using for smoke monitoring is these things called Ringelmann charts, which are just, you know, pieces of paper with different thicknesses of lines, and you would hold these charts up next to a plume of smoke to get a estimate of the visual opacity of the smoke plume. And if it's a number 1 smoke, this is like a 20% visual opacity. And you can compare that to a number 5 smoke, which is like 100% visual opacity. And so that's just a very coarse way to get at an estimate of, you know, how much air pollution is coming out of a stack. And so they would pay people to just walk around the city or stand up on a roof and look around the city and hold these charts up and to figure out, you know, who's the violator in the morning. And then they'd get on the phone and say, hey, you need to, your you know, chimney is putting out too much smoke. You need to go fix that. It's really interesting to me also that these regulations on visual opacity of smoke continue to be used today. There's a program where if you see a vehicle that's, you know, it's called rolling coal. If there's a plume of smoke coming out of the back of a diesel truck, and it's in Salt Lake County, you can, you know, enter their license plate number and where you saw them. It's the smoking vehicles reporting program, but it's essentially they're violating the visual opacity air quality regulations that, you know, go back to over 100 years ago. They did, you know, back then the air quality was extremely bad. The sulfur dioxide concentrations were extremely high. They measured particles in the air that were up to 2.5 milligrams. We're used to seeing these numbers in terms of micrograms per meter cubed, which would be 2,500 micrograms per meter cubed. It's really chunky air. But this last measurement really illustrates the severity of air pollution back then. And it's really kind of one of the most bracing stats that I've found in this. They did a really simple way of or technique to measure air pollution. They just would put these jars out around the city, and they would measure anything that fell into them, which is just the soot fall. And this is in that winter of 1919 and 1920. And in the railroad industrial part of town, they're measuring 1,000 tons per square mile in that winter of stuff that just fell out of the air into these jars. And then they would take the jars and they would weigh them, and they would dump them out, combust the material, and then they would weigh it again. And they found out that 50% of the stuff that's falling out of the air in this area of town was combustible. And that really indicates the level of incomplete combustion that was occurring. So one of the things that they were really worried about was wasted energy. And this is 50% of the fuel that they could have used for heat, for whatever productive purpose that they were using. And instead it's being emitted into the sky and causing air pollution. And so back then they were worried about running out of coal. And they're like, we need to be good stewards of our resources. And also this plays into, being good stewards of the environment. In 1930, natural gas was introduced in Salt Lake City. And this is a full-page advertisement for natural gas from the Utah Gas and Coke Company in Salt Lake and the Ogden Gas Company in Ogden. And they don't make advertisements like they used to. This thing it's hilarious to see this. They're envisioning the inversion as being this like giant blob hanging out over the city with like all of these smoke coming from all of this. Kind of looks like a giant spider from a B horror movie hanging over the city. And it's, the advertisements, be a better neighbor, remove the spot. And this is kind of a zoom in of the different little pictures that they had. It says, be a better neighbor. Do things like this disturb your neighborhood? You've got a cat screeching, and you got a guy spitting on the sidewalk. Nobody likes to see this, and person honking his horn, and a guy smoking a cigar in the bus. This is not the way. And then you have these dense clouds of smoke coming out of a chimney. And the text of this is hilarious too. He who removes the spot, the gloomy pall of smoke that pollutes the Salt Lake atmosphere every winter, is not only a better neighbor, but also a wiser father and a shrewder businessman, which is it's just hilarious to me. And really they thought in that era, they thought of natural gas as being a smokeless and stokeless fuel. It was more convenient, and it, they didn't know about the atmospheric chemistry, but they thought it was, it certainly was much better for air pollution than combusting coal. And this is a report from that era. And they really thought of natural gas as being a cure-all for the smoke problem. But they said, this is brand new technology. And, if we could get the majority of furnaces to use gas, to adopt gas, the air quality problem they thought would largely be solved. But even the most optimistic observer could not hope for such a thing. People just can't be induced to spend the money necessary to accomplish it. And they talk about the prices of natural gas then. So I just converted, inflation corrected these prices. So 50 cents per decatherm in 1930 is equivalent to about $9 per decatherm today, which is actually pretty close to what gas prices are right now. So gas prices were actually pretty similar, which is surprising to me. But the real kicker was this interconnection fee. They didn't have a network of natural gas pipes back then. So you had to pay $150, which is equivalent to $2,600 today, in order to get connected into the natural gas pipeline network. And of course, also the homes back then were not very well sealed. And so the typical home would end up using probably much more natural gas to heat itself than we use today. So it was actually probably quite expensive to use natural gas for home heating back then. But this is also interesting. The incumbent coal interests were really concerned about natural gas because the coal used for home heating is the cream of their business. It amounts to $2.5 million annually. So naturally, the coal people did not relish losing any portion of that business to natural gas. So it's just like, it's just a very natural thing. The incumbent industry is worried about this new upstart, cleaner technology that's going to put them out of business. And that's what happened, actually. Over the next couple of decades, people transitioned to natural gas very quickly. And by the 1990s, coal had basically disappeared as a home heating fuel in the state of Utah. And today, we have the highest percentage of homes heated by natural gas of any state in the country. And so what's fascinating to me about this is that, again, we talk about an energy transition. We're in an energy transition. Well, we actually have examples of energy transitions in Utah that have happened in our past. And this is an energy transition going from coal to natural gas for home heating. It led to an improvement in quality of life, an improvement in our environment, and lower costs for people. And as we transition, we're in the next stage of this overall transition, and we're starting to see heat pump technology really take off around the world and in Utah, and heat pumps for space heating and water heating. We're going to see, again, I predict that in the next couple of decades, as we transition to cleaner burning or cleaner fuels, we're going to see an improvement in quality of life, more comfortable homes, more convenient homes that are more comfortable to live in, and also improvements in our air quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just the arc of history is towards cleaner, more efficient technologies. During the Great Depression, efforts to control air pollution, were less important because the economy was really bad. As part of the New Deal, there were some smoke monitoring jobs in the late 1930s, but in the 40s, things continued to get worse. In the 40s, there was a really concerted effort to pass more air quality ordinances. This is the Salt Lake Telegram from March 1941. Nazis take over Bulgaria. This is the run-up to World War II. But here on the front page also, smoke density charts indicate that the Salt Lake problem has never been solved, and they, here's a chart of showing they're using these Ringelmann diagrams to, they've been using them for a couple of decades now at this point, tracking air quality every day, and they're trying to look at how air pollution has changed. They even published a thing called Today's Smoke, where they said, the smoke over to the west is, medium, and north is, they just like listed off the air quality conditions for the day, which are similar to what gets published now in the paper every day. Here's our current air quality conditions from the Division of Air Quality.
Excuse me, Logan.
Yeah.
We want to be sure to leave a little time for Q&A. We've got some questions rolling in. So if you wouldn't mind, would it be possible to wrap up in the next 5?
Yeah, we'll see. I'll work on it. During World War II, there was a big effort for industrial mobilization. Our air quality got a lot worse. This is the amount of time when we had low visibility due to air pollution. And then after World War II was over, when we defeated the Nazis, our air pollution got a little bit better. In the 1950s, this is when we did a lot of research on inversions and really started to understand how meteorology played a role in our air quality challenges. In 1962, the legislature commissioned a report looking at air resources in Utah. It was, again, a fantastic report that summarized all of this early work. And, but at the time, the technology for monitoring air quality was really changing a lot. And so they said, as a state, we want to collect more information before we take state action. And there's a lot of action going on at the city and county level, but the state wanted to get more data. This is also when there was a lot of action starting to happen in California and nationally on air quality. And the shift in the focus of air quality was changing at this time also because our energy was changing. And this is when vehicles became a really prominent and dominant source of air pollution. Initially vehicles didn't have any pollution controls and, they're extremely dirty. So, but here's this editorial from the Bountiful Mayor in 1966, He talks about how the electric automobile for clean, quiet, efficient urban transportation is the subject of sharply increased interest these days as a means of combating air pollution, noise, and traffic congestion. And they're even thinking about, in this last sentence of this, they're thinking about how EVs would be an excellent off-peak load builder for our city-owned utilities. So they're thinking about EV charging. And this was the 1966 Electrovaya from GM. And it was basically the equivalent of Nissan Leaf. And unfortunately, that program got mothballed. But now GM is committed to full electrification in about a decade. So things are finally starting to roll out. The state passed the Air Conservation Act in 1967, which created the first version of the Air Quality Board, and what's now known as Division of Air Quality came out of that. And really, the state was saying, like, we need to pass some regulations and some air quality standards to address air pollution. But then in 1970, just a few years later, the EPA was formed and we had federal air quality standards. And this is one of the first kind of stock takes on air pollution in Utah. And you can just see the number of exceedances of these different air pollutants. The details of what they aren't as important, just looking at how bad our air quality was in 1970. And it was unambiguously much worse than it is today. The first PM2.5 measurements in Utah were made in the winter of 81-82 as the EPA was developing the tools to measure smaller pollutants or smaller particulates. There's a really important story about Geneva Steel. Geneva Steel closed for 1 year in Provo. Geneva Steel is located in Provo. They closed for 1 year due to a labor strike. This is the front page of the Daily Herald the day that it opened back up. Geneva belches back to life with plume of smoke. And Dr. Arden Pope started looking at that era and to try to understand how the air pollution was affecting children's health, and found this really striking correlation. And that really led to a lot of research on this. Really changed the scientific understanding of how important particulates were for health impacts. And this is just the last little section I'll talk about here, and then we'll move on to questions. But in 1990, Governor Bangerter commissioned a clean air study. And they made a bunch of recommendations, which, we're still actually working on many of these ideas today. But at the beginning of the study, they took a step back and they said, Utah has really three broad policy options. Number one, we can just do nothing and let air pollution increase. Of course, that option, people are upset about air quality and it violates federal law. And so, that's not really a great option. Option two, we can basically, accept the, work to meet federal air quality standards. And, it's going to take some work. Utah's growing. We need to reduce our air pollution from what it is now in order to get into attainment. But, they're, at the end of this, they say this option appears to be current policy by default. And that's really what has happened for the last 30 years, is that we've just basically tried to meet federal air quality standards. And the state has kind of just outsourced our air quality goals to just the federal government. But there is this third option that exists. Utah has the choice to try to reduce air pollution significantly below the standards set by federal agencies. In the long term, this would cost significantly less than either of the other two options, because there's all of these benefits to better health and lower cost to consumers. And such a goal, they thought, is achievable if the state has the political will and creativity to accomplish it over time. But they started to look at, what would it really take in 1990 to really try to get at this? And then whenever they really started to dig into the details to reduce pollution well below federal standards, they ran into economic, technical, legal, regulatory, socioeconomic, and political issues, and compromise became necessary. And this is the thing that gives me hope, because what they didn't have in 1990, they didn't have in 1970, and they didn't have in 1920 were clean energy technologies. And that's what we have today. We're seeing the really fast deployment of electric vehicles and heat pumps. And we really have an opportunity today to do what Utahns have been trying to realize for over 150 years, which is, really tackle and really make significant problems on air quality. So just to conclude with some ideas, we've had air pollution challenges ever since we became a state. Our air quality has improved through time. When we look back at different time points, our air quality today is likely better since at any time since the late 1800s. And it demonstrates that environmental stewardship is essential for sustained economic development. And if our air quality was as bad as it was in 1970 or 1920, nobody would live here. And our growth would evaporate overnight. And it's because we've made progress on air pollution that we've been able to grow as a society here in Utah. We've been through energy transitions before, and there's many lessons about what has worked and what hasn't. And thinking about the future, again, I've said this, but we're seeing declining prices for renewable energy. We have this amazing opportunity. Utah can be the state that can lead the country in bipartisan solutions. We're a business-friendly state. I think in our bones, Utahns understand that we need to prioritize environmental stewardship and economic development. And Congressman Curtis is talking about this. Speaker of the House, Brad Wilson, has been talking about this. And Governor Cox, this is his the front page and his One Utah Roadmap. On the page about economic advancement, he's talking, everything that's highlighted here is all about energy or sustainable growth or environmental stewardship. And it really shows that, this idea that we need to incorporate environmental stewardship as part of our economic advancement, as part of Utah's success, is really essential. And so, and when I first saw this One Utah Roadmap, I thought, well, that's weird. It seems like a new and a fresh idea. And then after I did this deep dive into our history, I realized, actually, no, this has been part of Utah's ethic, for over 100 years. And really, we need to revive this ethic of stewardship. And I think that that's what we need to move forward into the future. All right. That's all I have. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Logan. Really appreciate you taking the time to present and share this presentation with us. I think it really brings home the fact that, we really do stand on the shoulders of the amazing people who've come before us and really kind of blazed this path and opened the conversation within our state. And I think sometimes you can feel isolated in this work. And this is a great reminder that we have a long history of people who've come before us and helping lay this groundwork and having some great outcomes. So we're poised to take it to the next level. So now I will go ahead and read a few questions. And for our guests, feel free to, we'll have some time. So feel free to put in the chat any questions that you may have. I will just read Bremen from BYU Sustainability says, you mentioned cars and buildings. Can you say more about where today's air pollution comes from?
Yeah, it really depends on what pollutant you're looking at. And there's different, each of the different air pollutants has the different mix. And so if we're talking about particulates, fine particulates, PM 2.5, most of that it's like something around ballpark 50% from vehicles, and then 30% from buildings, and then industry is I think on the order of like 10% ish. And those numbers will change over time as our technology changes. For ozone, it's a little different. And for carbon pollution, it's obviously very different as well. And that's for for CO2 and methane, it's, you know, the biggest contributors are in Utah, it's our electricity production, but that's changing very quickly as PacifiCorp is building out a lot of clean energy. But then, you know, it's vehicles and it's buildings again. And so, you know, decarbonizing, you know, reducing fossil fuel combustion helps and improves both air quality and greenhouse gas emissions.
Great. And Bremen also asks, what is the threshold where PM falls out of suspension in the air column? That is wild. And Alex Espejo, curious about this too, as well as the difference between winter and summer.
Yeah. So really, to fall out of suspension, you need a little bit bigger particles. PM2.5 will fall out of suspension. It takes a little bit longer. So it really comes down to the size of the particles. You know, you can also have ultrafine particles that can stay suspended for much longer. Yeah, but back then when I tell people about it, I say that this is air you can chew, which is really quite literal. Like you breathe in, it's like stuff it's just like, it's like gritty. And if any of you have traveled to a developing nation, you know, in many cases, it's still the case. I lived in Nepal for a couple of years, and in Kathmandu, there's, you know, just tons and tons of air pollution. You know, you on really bad days, like you go outside and it's like gritty in your mouth. There's so much stuff in the air.
Great. Then, excuse me, Daniel Kelly observes or comments, appreciate a nice analogy, coal to gas, gas to electric, electric generated through clean methods. So you really bring that home, Logan. George Hanley writes, fantastic, great presentation, have to run, but thank you. And then we have a number of others. Let's see. Daniel Kelly also comments, love the examples of key times in the past where substantial progress and transitions occurred. Debbie asks, do you have a link to the timeline on the U of U library website?
Yes, I meant to pull that up. I am going to post in the chat for anyone who's interested. There is a digital exhibit. Let's see. So there's a digital exhibit on this, and I'll pull it up so everyone can see. I worked with the Merritt Library to create a digital exhibit that has this whole history. There's a timeline that you can click through, which has all of these articles on it that you can just go and check out. And there's little blurbs about each one of them. And so you can go and look through time, and you can, you know, these all have links to the full articles where you can check those out. There's a whole thing on women leadership in this area. There's comparisons between then and now. So here's, you know, a picture in 1967 and a picture from one of the inversions we had from last winter. You know, essays about environment and the economy and Utah's future. I wrote this essay about, you know, where we're heading in our future. And then also I wrote a scientific article on this. So if you really are a glutton for punishment, you're welcome to check that out. One of the most useful things about this is that it's got all of the references at the bottom with all of the links to all of the references here. So if you want to dig through the old archives, this is another way to find them. There's, you know, almost 150 references in this paper. And there was a great Trib article about the digital exhibit that came out fairly recently. So